Geisha College of Hebrew Studies, who will speak on the topic of varieties and vagaries in constitutional and halachic interpretation.
Ladies and gentlemen, I should tell you this is a first for me too in Yerushalayim. This is the first time I've ever spoken in public in Yerushalayim in English. And hopefully, as your wish is announced, maybe next time it will be in Parat HaKodesh. Beginning of the Supreme Court term in the United States is always on the first Monday in October. And the first Monday in October invariably coincides with the Chagim to a degree of Chodesh Tishrei. So that usually I am in the middle of the observances of the RAV HaItanim when the Supreme Court opens its term. And I suddenly find that my major academic interest, which is the United States Supreme Court and constitutional law, and my major interest as a person, my very being, that is the hope and the prayer that I have the schus l'lmod lamed l'shmor v'lasot l'chayim, are both intertwined and made possible only through the power and wisdom and the scope of interpretation. Call it parshanut or darshanut. In both areas of interest, albeit of differing degree, to a very great degree, so much of knowledge, and more importantly the actual behavior, the l'shmor v'lasot l'chayim, is determined by human interpretation, by the human element added to a previously written text, which I universally regarded as being of a high order. Torah Kedosha, Torah Shebiksav, and Lehev Havdil Elef Havdalos, the United States Constitution, are both given meaning beyond the limits of language of a written document, be it a Torah Kedosha Mipiv Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or a constitution written by a group of founding fathers meeting in Philadelphia at the end of the 18th century. Both are given meaning by human intellect and human interpretation. For the month of Tishrei, that which is called in Nevi'im as the RAV HaItanim, the month of the fortress in Jewish life, plays such a central role in the hearts and minds of Jews, all kinds of Jews, with all degrees of knowledge and observance and affiliation, from all corners of the world. And you realize that the vast majority of its ordinances, observances, rules, regulations, and rituals are the result of the power and the panoply of an interpretation of Chazal, the limited, obscure, sometimes contradictory language of the Torah Shebiksav. Upon reflection, what we do, Chodesh Tishrei, in the mitzvot of Chodesh Tishrei, invariably are the result of the interpretation of the Torah Shebal Peh, as it gives meaning to Torah Shebiksav. If Chief Justice Marshall, in one of his most famous dicta, in the very famous case of McCulloch versus Maryland, anyone who took the Regents to the United States still remembers that case from 1890, reminded early Americans that we must never forget that it is a constitution we are expounding, and thus justify the establishment of a national bank by a central government, despite any specific language in the American Constitution which gave such a power to the central government. How much more so shall we, Shomrei Torah Mitzvah, be impressed by Divrei Chazal and by the methodology of Chazal in defining the parameters, procedures, and practices of Chodesh Tishrei, as in the language of the Torah Shebiksav. What is more amazing is the range of laws of Chiyuvim and the order and the Seder which have been read into the Torah Shebiksav and which go far beyond anything known in American constitutional law in methodology, scope, latitude granted to those whose interest in language of Torah within the rules of law, the actual practice of halacha which makes the demands of us. Although the obvious focus of my talk in discussing constitutional vagaries is the United States Constitution, and that's what I started to write about, suddenly the recent news that here in Eretz Yisrael, once again, there is an attempt to write a secular constitution, and that this secular constitution will have a Bill of Rights added to it, and also that the power of judicial review will be granted, I think, to the Bet Mishpat Elyon or to some other courts in Eretz Yisrael. Hopefully will give my remarks the greatest sense of relevancy and urgency. Israeli society, and also how to deal with the powers of interpretation of a judicial branch which will now determine the legitimacy of the acts of the legislature and the executive. Establishing the doctrine of judicial review in 1803. Let me pause now for a moment to explain what judicial review means. Judicial review means the power of a court. In the United States, any court, from the lowest to the highest, but invariably the issue is important enough that will come to the Supreme Court, is the power of a court to review the acts of the other branches of government and to see whether they fall within the confines of a constitution which limits government. The result of whether the act is constitutional or unconstitutional is the result of judicial review. The great power of judicial review is that an unelected branch can look at the other acts of government and see if they fall within their definition of what the Constitution permits government. Once Marshall in 1803 had established the right of judicial review in another famous case that most of you remember, Marbury versus Madison, he therefore came with a corollary that said that the Constitution is a superior paramount law to any law of the legislature, and more importantly, that the Constitution is a gate or offense, F-E-N-C-E, beyond which later man-made law cannot go. Let me, if I might, just quote a little bit from Marbury versus Madison, in which Marshall tells us as follows. The original supreme will organizes the government and assigns to certain departments their respective powers. It may either stop here or establish certain limits not to be transcended by these departments. The government of the United States is of the latter description. The powers of the legislature are defined and limited. And that those limits may not be mistaken or forgotten, the Constitution is written. To what purpose are powers limited, and to what purpose is that limitation committed to writing? If these limits may at any time be passed by those intended to be restrained. The distinction between a government with limited and unlimited powers is abolished if those limits do not confine the persons on whom they were imposed, and if acts prohibited and acts allowed are of equal obligation. It is a proposition too plain to be contested that the Constitution controls any legislative act repugnant to it. Between these alternatives, there is no middle ground. The Constitution is either superior paramount law, unchangeable by ordinary means, or it is on a level with ordinary legislative acts, and like other acts is alterable when the legislature shall please to alter it. If the former part of the alternative be true, then a legislative act contrary to the Constitution is not law. Namely, that if the Constitution is a higher law, then anything contrary to it cannot count. If the latter part be true, that the Constitution is not of a higher law, then written constitutions are absurd attempts on the part of people to limit a power in its own nature illimited. What Marshall did in Marbury versus Madison is to say that the Constitution is a gate. So far government can go, and there comes a point somewhere where you have the right to say you have gone beyond the limit. You have now gone beyond the sign that says Atzar or Machzon, you cannot go any further. He established the Constitution as a gate which said so far government can act. Interestingly enough, powerful as Marshall's reasoning is, it is not correct. There are many countries who have written constitutions, but do not have or have not given the courts the power of judicial review. And why do they write a constitution? Because they view the Constitution as a road that says, this is the road you should go on. This is the path we think you should take. When you get to its border, think twice. And so what has evolved is what we call the road or the gate theory. Marshall viewed the American Constitution as a gate which said to government, so far can you go, and not beyond it. Who will decide what is the beyond we'll come to shortly. Others view the Constitution as a road which says, Es haderech yelchubo. This is the road on which ye shall go. And if you permit me an aside or an obiter dicta, the Hebrew language is very precise. And most words in Hebrew are clearly either zachar or nekeva. One of the few words that in Hebrew is zachar and nekeva is the word derech. Obviously, to teach us that there must be more than one derech in life, and there might be more than one interpretation of judicial review. Thus, whatever the political outlook, whether liberal or conservative, whatever government does in the American constitutional system must fall within the written language. The first question in America always, when some novel legislation is being considered, is it constitutional? Not is it good, is it right, is it proper, but is it constitutional, and therefore will it fall within the confines of a constitution that limits power of government. Great French philosopher, Tocqueville, coming to America in the 1830s, noted that in America, all great social issues become constitutional issues. Because if the issue is important enough, and decide that Sache Keneged is in fear of losing, having lost in the political arena, they will now run to the judicial arena saying what government now chooses to you is beyond the power of the effect. And there are indeed several ways of looking at how one can interpret a constitution in a democracy. The most simplistic one is the so-called mechanical theory of judicial interpretation. Namely, along comes a claim that this law is beyond the power of government. And now it falls to a judge to interpret whether this law falls beyond the power of government is limited. And so Justice Roberts, in a very famous case in the New Deal period, when most of the social legislation of the New Deal era was being declared unconstitutional, Justice Roberts said, all the judge does is lay the article of the Constitution which is invoked beside the statute which is challenged to decide whether the latter squares with the former. All the judge does is lay the law next to the Constitution. Versteht sich, what he didn't tell the world was that if you lay it down krum, it can never square. If you put it down unequal, it will never square. And the great power of the judge is the degree and the angle at which he lays the law next to the Constitution to see whether it's square or not. The Constitution made the law, but how far one lays it and where one puts it, that's where the question comes. And this, of course, is the new machloket in American constitutional law, as we see being fought out. Those of you who can remember 5 years back, when Robert Bork was up for appointment to the Supreme Court, was the last time we had the great public forum, and as to what the power of a judge should do and what the power of a court should be. I leave out the political agenda involved, but it was the last time we discussed in public between the so-called machloket of the original understanding theory, that the judge must apply to every modern circumstance the principle laid down by the original Constitution. That the social agenda must be set by the legislature or the executive, not by the judicial. There is a wonderful, wonderful story in line with this classical theory, that the job of the judge is to always be bound by the meaning of the Constitution, involving two of the great gedolim in American judicial history. Justice Holmes of the Supreme Court and Judge Learned Hand, the great judge of the United States Court of Appeals on the Second Circuit, who never got to the Supreme Court. And the story, is whether it's emet or it's apocryphal, it certainly has become emet in the annals of constitutional law, is that Hand and Holmes were having lunch one morning. And after the lunch was over, as Holmes was ready to go home, Hand said to him, "Do justice, sir, do justice." And Holmes looked back at him and said, "That is not my job. It is my job to apply the law. Justice is an abstract principle, and that's to be achieved by the other branches of government who express the popular will and who have a chance to be either corrected or uncorrected at the next election." Those who object to the original understanding say we should not be bound by a constitution that's 200 years old, or by a 14th Amendment that was written 125 years ago. And to them, the Constitution has value for when it was written, but the dead should not govern the life of the living. The Constitution must change as society changes. It must be a phrase of a living Constitution. And so we now see this great battle in a phrase that you may have seen many times in the papers, something called substantive due process. In other words, that a law that Congress writes, besides being legally correct, should be fair. It should be right. It should express a certain mores and a certain ethic, that if the law is not right, then it should not be a law. And without going into Barichut, and if I'll permit, I'll dump a few cards. The basic issue as we now see it is being fought primarily on this now in a case called Roe versus Wade, better known as the constitutional law of the abortion case. Amazing. This great moral issue, which has divided the country so terribly over a Supreme Court decision, in which the Supreme Court announced a certain right of privacy, the right of the woman to decide the fate of the embryo. I'm not here to go into the moral halakha reasons. There is nowhere in the Constitution that such a right of privacy exists. The Constitution gives examples of privacy. No one has the right to be searched in his home without a warrant. But the fact that something takes place in private doesn't automatically mean it's mutter. Most criminal deals are arranged in private. And most drug sales are made in private. And most parents who abuse their children do it in private too. So the fact that it's done in the privacy of one's home does not automatically give it some guarantee of privacy unless the Constitution chose to derive that privacy. Be what it may, whatever the two studies are involved in, this battle is still fought over. Is it in the Constitution? Is it not in the Constitution? Mr. Bork, how will you interpret the Constitution? Yeh Mashiach. The final feature of the American constitutional law is that whatever government does must somewhere be within the interstices of the Constitution. And even though Charles Evans Hughes, in 1907, when he was an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, once said, "We are under Constitution, but the Constitution is what we judges say it is. It still lies on the judge to prove that what he said has some makar in some phrase in the Constitution. No matter how broadly or narrowly we wish to interpret the Constitution, in the language of the early 19th century, whether you called it the loose or the strict construction of the Constitution, it in no way compares to the breadth and scope and ingenuity of Torah interpretation as it applies to the laws of Chodesh Tishrei." What I would like to do now is do some of the halachot of Chodesh Tishrei and see how we, Chazal, have interpreted our Constitution, the Torah Shebiksav, to the practices that we now do in the Chodesh HaTorah. What is it, my friends, that is the first, if I say the word Tishrei, what is the first mitzvah that comes to mind? Well, I should say the first mitzvah that comes to mind, the mitzvah of Tkiyat Shofar. What is the basic mitzvah of Tkiyat Shofar? The basic mitzvah is 9 kolot, 3 truot, and 6 tkiyot. That is the basic mitzvah. But how did we arrive at this formulation? That the basic mitzvah of Tkiyat Shofar is 3 truot with 6 tkiyot. There are 3 psukim in the Torah, and I now cite them in the chronological order, the way they're written in the Torah. The first pasuk is in Parshas Emor. "B'chodesh hashvi'i be'echad lachodesh yeh lachem Shabbaton zichron truah." The second pasuk, in chronological order, does not deal with Rosh Hashanah at all. A pasuk in Parshas Bahar, "V'havarta shofar truah b'chodesh hashvi'i be'esol lachodesh b'yom ha'kippurim ta'aviru shofar b'chol artzachem." And the third pasuk, which is a pasuk in Pinchas, is "B'chodesh hashvi'i be'echad lachodesh yom truah yeh lachem." Let us now, if we will, analyze these 3 psukim that mention that there is a Yom Truah somewhere in the Jewish calendar. That there is a Yom Truah and a Chiyuv Truah. Let us now look at what the Constitution, the Torah Shebiksav, told us. There are 2 mentions of Truah on the day of Rosh Hashanah. Namely, B'chodesh hashvi be'echad lachodesh, the pasuk in Emor, and B'chodesh hashvi be'echad lachodesh, the pasuk in Pinchas. The third mention of Truah is on Yom Kippur. "V'havarta shofar truah b'chodesh hashvi be'asor lachodesh b'yom ha'kippurim ta'aviru shofar b'chol artzachem." Let us just for a moment turn to the 2 truahs of Rosh Hashanah. The pasuk in Parshas Emor says, "Yeh lachem Shabbaton zichron truah," a remembrance of the truah. The pasuk in Parshas Pinchas reads, "Yom truah yeh lachem." This contradiction was already caught by the Gemara. And so the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, Daf Chaf Testament base, says, "Lo kasha." In one place it says Yom Zichron Truah, and the other place it says Yom Truah. And so the Gemara answers, "Lo kasha. Kan be Yom Tov shechal liyot b'Shabbat, kan be Yom Tov shechal liyot b'chol." Yeh Mashiach, the Gemara eventually comes out with a different time toward the end, but the Gemara thought they had answered this contradiction. So even though that on the surface there was a Rosh Hashanah day of only Zichron Truah, and Rashi says on the word Zichron Truah, Rashi reads as follows: "V'lo Truah mamish, ela mikraot shel Truah yomru." Just recite psukim of Truah. This didn't prevent the interpretation of the Gemara on Daf Lamed Gimel of pitting these 2 Truah together, Zichron Truah and Yom Truah, together, and adding to it the third Truah, V'havarta shofar Truah, even though this is a shofar Truah on Yom Kippur that takes place once every 50 years. 150. In the language of the Gemara, Rosh Hashanah Daf Lamed Dalet, "Uminayin l'shalish shel shalish shalish." Talmud Leiman. How do we know one has to blow 3 sets of 3? "V'havarta shofar truah," the pasuk of Yovel, Shabbaton Zichron Trua, the pasuk in Emor, and Yom Trua Yelachem, the pasuk in Pinchas. But the powers of Torah interpretation go even further than that. Not only did we use the Trua of Yovel to get 3 Truas on Rosh Hashanah instead of 2, but we also got 6 Tkiyas out of the Trua of Yovel. Because there are no Tkiyas written in the constitution of the Torah Shabbat with regard to Trua of Rosh Hashanah. How do we know? The Gemara asks, Uminayin shepshuta lefaneo Talmud Laima v'havar shofar Trua. How do we know that one has to blow a Tkiyah before one blows a Trua? It says v'havar shofar Trua, pasuk by Yovel. How do we know that one has to blow a Tkiyah after a Trua? Uminayin shepshuta lachrea Talmud Loma ta'aviru shofar v'chol atzechem. The Eil Yelad B'Yovel, the Gemara asks. How do we know that it also applies Minayin Rosh Hashanah, Talmud Loma, Chodesh Hashvi, that all the kolot in Chodesh Hashvi have to be the same? Remarkable. Thus, not only did the V'havar to Shofar Trua of Yom Kippur determine the number of Truot of Rosh Hashanah, it also determined the number of Tkiyot on Rosh Hashanah as well. Clearly an interpretation far more original than even Marshall had in mind in marvelous sense. However, it goes even further. In the language of Rashi, on the Seder Tkiyot, Shalot, we both 6 Tkiyot, that Tkiyah, Utrua, Utkiyah, L'chol Achat V'Achat, having interpreted the Torah constitution in such a manner as to how many Truot to blow, and the prologue and epilogue that accompanies each Truah, namely a Tkiyah Lefaneh, a Tkiyah Lachrea, the interpreters of the Torah now have to resolve the next problem as a result of the limit of written language. The next problem you already guessed, namely, what is a Trua? I don't wish now to go into the machloket of Ma'asava Genuchi Ganach, that it's some sort of a sigh, or Ma'asava Yeluli Yoli, but rather a series of short weeping. That's not what interests me. But rather, it's the unique method of interpretation out of how to solve the problem of Yom Trua Yelachem as to how to perform the mitzvah Trua. All of you are familiar, no doubt, with the solution. We are familiar, we all practice it. The solution of the Gemara. Iskin Ababua Bekisri, Tkiyah, Shleish Shvarim Tkiyah. Ababua Bekisri came up with the solution that we will blow a Tkiyah and a Shvarim Trua, and we'll blow a Tkiyah. And then the Gemara, if you have time, makes a long cheshbon as to why we must have a Tkiyah, a Shvarim Trua, and a Tkiyah. To take care of all the problems we can do. Is it both together? Is one a hafsaka, one or the other? After all, if you have a shvarim trua, why shouldn't you have a trua shvarim? And the Gemara says, no, a shvarim trua does not make sense, because that's not the way people cry. Which brings about the solution which the Gemara finally came up with, having considered all these features, of that which we know. 3 tashrats, 3 tashats, and 3 tarats. And yet, despite this ingenious accommodation, which Rav Hai Gaon indicates in the Tshuva, is of a much later vintage. Rav Hai Gaon writes, Miyamim Kadmonim, in early days, Haya Minhag B'chol Yisrael, the minig among the people of Israel was, Mehem Osin Trua Yevavot Ktanot. Some made a Trua of the short notes, the 9 short notes. Umehem Osim Yevavot Kvedot. Some made longer krechts. Shehem Shvarim. Ve'elu Yotzin Yidei Chavatan. And both are correct. Rabbabu, Hiskin, Minad Achid. Rabbabu came along with only one way to do it. That the non-average man in the street, but the non-simple man, might have seen this in machloket, there's different kinds, and so he came out with a nusach achid that will now blow a tashrat. And yet there was still great difference as to how to blow this tashrat, tashat, and tarat, especially with regard to tkiyas the movement. Tkiyas the movement, listen to the different variations among the Rishonim. The Rambam and the Rif say that one blows for Malchias a tashrat, one for Zichronos a tashat, and for Shofrat a tarat, one. The Rabbeinu Tam says that one blows a tashrat for Malchias, Zichronos, and Shofrat. The Mechaber in Shulchan Aruch says no. You blow for Malchias 3 tashrats, and for Zichronos 3 tashats, and for Shofrat 3 tarats. And the solution that we all have come up with is the derech that was brought by the Shalah, that the Tkimis, the Meyuvid, will blow one Tashrat, Tashat, and Tarat, all three different times. Notice how all the Rishonim could not decide how it is that one will now blow the Truah, even though I had all these elements, which is Almond. And thus the result of this is that Tekiyas Meyushiv and Tekiyas the Mu'umid are blown differently. Am I not correct? That in Tekiyas the Meyushiv you blow 3 Tashrats, 3 Tashats, and 3 Tarats, whereas when it comes to Tekiyas the Mu'umid, you blow a Tashrat, a Tashat, and a Tarat 3 different times from Alfiyot, Zichronot, and Shachorot. What is of interest on the terms of the written constitution with regards is a kasha that Taisvus asks with regards to Tekiyas the Mu'umid in general. You're all familiar with a magnificent, beautiful Gemara in Rosh Hashanah. Gemara in Rosh Hashanah asks, Elaloma taikinu meriyin kishahen yoshvin, v'tokinu meriyin kishahen omdu. Why do we blow Tekiyas the Meyushiv, which is the first Tekiyah before we daven Seishman Esra, and why do we blow Tekiyas the Mu'umid? Either Chazar Sashatz, those who daven Nesach Svad, say do it both in the Shtul Shman Esra and the Chazar Sashatz. And the Gemara answers, Kidei la'arbei v'asatan, to confuse the Satan. And the answer is not as most people think to confuse him, because you blow it once and twice, he doesn't know which way to blow it. That's not the way Rashi said it. Rashi said as follows. What is l'arbei v'asatan? Shelo yastin. The Satan will not have any koch to speak evil of us. Kishe yishma Yisrael mechabavin et mitzvot, to show that Bnei Yisrael love the mitzvah so much. Mistaten in dvarav. When he sees that we do the mitzvah twice, that we repeat it, that it proves that we love mitzvah so much for him. And so we blow it to Tekiyah twice. And Taisus comes up. It's an impressive and ennobling thought. And yet Taisus comes along and says, I have a kasha from the written constitution. Why is he not over on Baal Taisuf? Why should you be allowed to blow the shofar twice? Why are you not over Baal Taisuf? In other words, should not the written law control the action of this interpretation? What about the written law that says Baal Taisuf? Taisus comes up with a very profound answer. Taisus, I'll quote the language of Taisus. The ein shayach Baal Tosif b'asiyas mitzvah achad beit panim. There's no, doing the same mitzvah twice is not Baal Tosif. Kigon kohen im mevarech v'chozer mevarech otot tzibur atzmo. The kohen can bless it twice. O notel lulav v'chozer v'notel. Takes the lulav twice. V'chein tokeya v'chozer v'tokeya. Even though the second time he's blowing the Tekiyas the Meyushiv are blown differently than the Tekiyas the Mu'umid. And yet Taisus to this. It is with regards the Zman Simchatenu, Chag of Zman Simchatenu, that we see further how broad is the scope of the power to interpret the law in the hands of Chazal as they grapple with the constitution of Torah Shebiksav of the mitzvot of Chag Sukkot. There's a remarkable incident in the Mishnah in Sukkah Daf Chavches. Mishnah tells us as follows. Misha haya rosho v'rubo b'sukkah v'shulchano b'toch habayit v'shamai posmin u'beis tilo machshav. A man, his head and most of his body is in the sukkah, and his table is out of the sukkah, it's in the house. So there's a machloket beis Shammai and beis Hillel, whether that's permissible. The question of machloket is shema yimashach achrei shulchano. Normally a person, if he eats, is going to eat at the table, and therefore will eat at the table which is not the sukkah. And the Gemara is never lost. The Mishnah then tells an interesting story. Mishnah tells as follows. Ma'aseh sheholchu ziknei beit Shammai or ziknei beit Hillel levaker es Rav Yochanan ben Acharani. They went to be mevakach for Rav Yochanan ben Acharani. Why it is that both Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai went at first one time. Shohaya Yoshev Rosha v'ruba b'sukkah. He was sitting Rosha most his head and most of his body in the sukkah. V'shulchano b'toch habayit. And his table was in the house. Is in machloket in the Mishnah as to who said what, but the final language of the Mishnah is as follows. Afheim amrulo. Beit Shammai said to Rav Yochanan ben Acharani, Im kein hayita noig. If this is the way you've been eating in your sukkah all along, till now you had Rosho v'rubo b'sukkah v'shulchano b'toch habayit, lo kiyamta mitzvat sukkah miyamecha. You never observed the mitzvah sukkah. Remarkable lesson to learn. That although the position of Beit Shammai is because of the Gzeirah, Shema Yimashach Achar Shulchanai. It's on Zerah. That the Gzeirah D'Rabbanan is powerful to nullify his mitzvah yeshivat sukkah in Oka. In other words, even though he went not once, was Nimshach Acha Shulchano, that once we have the power to interpret the law, that we have the power to say this is the rule of the Rabbanan, then any other behavior you do it, even if you never violate it. The language of the Rambam, which even more gives credence to this. The language of the Rambam reads as follows: Mishahaya Rosho v'Rubo b'Sukkah, v'Shulchano b'Tor Beito, achotz l'Sukkah, v'Ochel hareza asur, u'ki'ilu lo yashav b'Sukkah. The Rambam had to add the phrase hareza asur. Interestingly, the Gemara never used the word asur. The Gemara used the word poslin, machshirin. The Gemara never used the word yatza or lo yatza. The Mechaber uses the word kilu lo yashav b'Sukkah. The word hareza asur somehow seems to infer Chazal having made this rule, that it now takes precedent. There is, if I might, an interesting twist and variation with regards to Chazal's interpretive power of the written language, in which, although the interpretation of the written language determines the nature and the essence of the law, and the hanhaga of the law, it is the written law, the Torah itself, more precisely, the number of words in the written law which governs the method of its performance. And this we find both with regard to the two major mitzvot of the Zman Simchatenu, the mitzvah of Sukkah and the mitzvah of RAV Michel. A novel phenomenon, that the number of words in Torah Shebiksav, which determines the practical application of the halacha. Sukkah. Now the word Sukkah literally refers to the schach on the top of the sukkah. Yet you all know that without the fanot, without walls, you have nothing to put the sukkah on top of. Question the Talmud asks: how many walls and what are the measurements of a sukkah? And you're all familiar with the psak of the Gemara. The Gemara tells us v'hilchasa shtayim kilchasan u'shlishi afilataf, that two walls have to be the right size, zayin al zayin, 10 tefachim high. The third one can be even a tefach. Question: how did the Gemara arrive at this mathematical formulation? See, I finally got the word mathematics in this conference of mathematics and logic. How did the Gemara arrive at this mathematical formulation? The language of the Gemara reads as follows: Tana Rabbah, shtayim kil chasan u'shlishis afilu tefach. Two proper-sized walls and a third even tefach. Rab Shimon Omer, Rab Shimon says, shalish kil chasan, 3 walls have to have the proper measurements, or to be afilu tefach. And the fourth is sufficient if it's only a tefach. My conclusion, what is the source of the machloket? Rabbanan Savri Yeshem L'Masoret, that one gives credence to the way it's written in the Torah. Rab Shimon Sava Yeshem L'Mikra, that we give credence to the way the Torah Shebiksav is read out loud. And now comes the mathematics. Rabbanan Savri, the Rabbanan hold Yeshem L'Masoret, that one has to follow the written text in the Torah. And in the Torah we have 3 words: Basukot, Basukot, Basukot. Only 2 of the Basukot are written without a vav. And so since they're not written without a vav, then each one is 1. And you have 1 Basukot which is written with a vav. A vav automatically makes it a plural. So even in a little bit of arithmetic that I know, 1 plus 1 plus 2 equals 4. And then the Chacham say, Harei na'at arba, I now have 4 walls. Dal chad legufei, I have to take one of the words Basukot to know that I have to sit in the sukkah. Pashul atilsa. Therefore 3 have remained, and therefore there are 3 walls. Rab Shimon says, Yeshem L'Mikra, that one gives credence and the power to the way one reads it. And whether it has a vav or it doesn't have a vav, when we read the Torah, we read, Basukot Yeshvu, Kol Ezrach Yisrael, Yeshvu Basukot, L'man Yedu Dorasechem Ki Basukot Hashaftet B'nei Yisrael. So 3 times you hear the word Sukot, which is a plural form. 3 times 2 equals 6. Harei ha'kan shesh, I have 6. Dal chad legufei, take away one of the Basukot to tell me the mitzvah itself. Pashula arba, I now have 4 walls. And then the Hilchasa comes and says that the 4th or the 3rd wall can be of a lesser size. Although the essence of the machloket is in Yeshem L'Masoros or Yeshem L'Mikra, the source of the machloket is the number of times Basukot 3 is written in the Torah. In other words, it's the number of words that determine the parameters of the mathematical computations. A similar mathematical computation is found with regard to the mitzvah of Arba Minim. Namely, that the number of words in the Torah Shebiksav determines the method of performing the mitzvah. A mission in Sukkah. Rabbi Shmuel says, Shlosha hadasim, you need 3 hadasim, u'shtei aravot, 2 aravos, lulav echad, 1 lulav, v'esrig echad, 1 esrig. Who could possibly afford 2? Gemara now continues. Gemara, Tanya Rabbi Shmuel says, creates hadar echad. Creates, that means 1 esrig. Kapot Marim Echad. Even though kapot is a plural, but it's written kapat, so it's one loop. Anaf Eitz Avot, Shlosha. Hadasim, it says another 3. Arvei Nachal is a plural, Shtayim. Question, where did Rabbi Shmuel get 3 Hadasim from Anaf Eitz Avot? Where did he get 3? Rashi says very simple. Right? Anaf Chad, Eitz Chad, Avot Chad, 3 words, 3 Hadasim. 3 words, 3 Hadasim. Thus, even though the words Anaf Eitz Avot have been previously interpreted on Daf Lamed Bet Lamed Bez in the Torah Bal Peh form to describe the nature of Hadasim, the Gemara on Daf Lamed Bez says on the word Anaf Eitz, She'anafav Chofim et Eitzot. Anaf Eitz means it has to have the kind of leaves that cover the branch. And Eitz Avot, to tell us that has to be Kalua Kivin Clear, that has to be pleated. That even though, so we have now taken care of all the Torah Bal Peh formulations, the fact that there are 3 words is viewed by Rabbi Shmuel to determine the number of Hadasim. If you have a kasha, what do I do with the phrase pre-Eitz Hadar? There's also 3 words. It's a very good kasha. Places this. Ceremony of Nisach Hamayim. That which the Mishnah tells us, Kol Misha lo ra'as mechat beit ha-shoeva, lo ra'as mechama yava. And the Gemara tells us, Chad Tani Shoeva, that it's a Beit HaShoeva, V'chad Tani Chashuva, that it's a Simcha, that's Chashuva, Mitzvah Chashuva hi, Uba Misheshi Shemei Breshit. And the Yerushalmi tells us that the celebration is not only Simchat Mayim, but rather Shemisham Shav and Ruach HaKodesh. And that Jonah and Amitai, what's present at the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, V'sharta alav Shchina, L'lamdecha Sheila Shchina Shara El Mitoch Simcha. With regards to the mitzvah of Nisach Hamayim, we see a broad spectrum of interpretation as to the source of the mitzvah. And that as a result of the differences of the source of interpretation, there will be a difference of its observance. Namely, the Kiyum HaMitzvah of Nisach Hamayim will depend on the source of the mitzvah, which is not mentioned in the Torah. In fine, the interpretation will determine the degree of the observance. What is the source of Nisach Hamayim? Which the Mishnah in Sukkah Membei so blithely said, Sukkah v'Nisach Hamayim Shiva, that it's a mitzvah of 7 days. Yet if one looks at the interpretation of the sources, one will find a differing degree on the days of observance. Gemara in Tainis tells us, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says, it's Ne'ema, it says in the Torah, Hasheni, on the 2nd day, instead of saying Minchasav and Niskah, it says Niskeihem. And on the 6th day, instead of saying Minchasav and Niskah, it says in the Sacher with an extra Yud. And on the Mashvi, instead of Kamishpat, it says Kamishpatam. Hare Mem, Yud, Mem spells Mayim. And therefore you have a remez for Nisach Hamayim in a Torah. Rabbi Kiva says Bishishi. Why? Because on the 6th day it says V'Nisacher in the plural, V'Nisach Hamayim, or V'Nisach Hayam. As a result of the different biblical interpretation of the biblical source, the Gemara tells us that according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, Nisach Hamayim Shita Yamim was 6 days. Because one began to interpret the mitzvah of Nisach Hamayim, where was the source? From the 2nd day when it said V'Nizkehem, and therefore you start from the 2nd, and you went to the 7th, so you had 6 days. According to Rabbi Kiva, the Gemara says Triyemi, that Nisach Hamayim would only be 2 days. And so the Gemara concluded, Nisach Hamayim Kol Shiva Hilchas Gemirula. It's Halacha L'Moshe Sinai, because based upon the sources of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira and Rabbi Kiva, it would either be 6 days or 2 days. Namely, that the source of the interpretation would also determine the method of its interpretation. The Halacha L'Moshe Sinai, which is a din Torah Bal Peh, the Li Yisod Min Torah, would now determine. Interesting, the Rambam put down specifically Nisach Hamayim is 7 days. And he said the reason being Hilchos Halacha Moshe Sinai, because based upon the Mem Yud Mem, or the Nesacher approach, it would have been either 6 days or 2 days. But of special interest to me is something else. Is that the Gemara recognized that this search to find the source of the interpretation of Nisach Hamayim, that search of Torah Shebal Peh, that too is Torah. Listen, if you will, to a language of the Gemara. Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says, Umipnei ma amra Torah nischu mayim b'chad. Why did the Torah say nischu mayim b'chad? Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Nischal afonei mayim b'chad, k'dei sheyizbaruchu lachem gishmei shalem. Amra Torah, where did the Torah say it? Here we've now all agreed that Nisach HaMayim is halacha l'Moshe Sinai. We've all agreed that it's only based upon an asnach, or some sort of yesod, and yet the Gemara said, with Nema Amra Torah, recognizing full well that the Torah Shabbal Peh is Torah itself. The conclusion is that the words of Chazal themselves are Amra Torah. Let me, if I might, without summation, conclude with just one more word. I told I should do a summary, but I read that. Let me, if I might, conclude with this. The magnificent Gemara in Makkos. Gemara says, Amar Rava, Kama Tipshoi Shadinchi. How silly are so many of the people. The Kaini Mekami Sefer Torah, they stand up for Sefer Torah, V'lai Kaini Mekami Gavarav, and do not stand up for Talmud Chacham. The Ilu B'Sefer Torah K'tiv, in the Sefer Torah it says, Arboim Yaket. That if one has to get Malchus, you give him 40. For Asu Rabbanan, and the Rabbanan came along, Batzru Chada, and they made it one less. This the Gemara called, number one, a Gavra Abba, but more importantly, this alone Chazal. If one stands up for Sefer Torah, then must one also stand up for Mefrashei Torah, even if they're Mekel and not Mahmed. And that hopefully is the lesson. And if I might just conclude on a rabbinic sermonic note, probably have rabbis or professors or practicing rabbis. I've also once asked, why is the Sukkot called Zman Simchatenu in a general name? It has no specific name. Pesach is called Zman Cherutenu. Shavuot is called Zman Matan Toratenu. Why was Sukkot given such a general name? Zman Simchatenu. I have no doubt there are many answers. I have no doubt there have been many sermons preached on it too. But for myself, if Ein Simcha ki Simchat Torah, then there is no greater example of the joining together of Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh. The human power to interpret, as is found in the mitzvot of Sukkot, and that's why it's Zman Simchatenu for us.